Hello, and welcome to the Rules of the Game podcast, where I discuss and analyze democratic institutions. The draft of the new Constitution of Chile is now published. The Constitutional Convention met for the first time on July 4th, 2021, and has now completed a draft constitution that the people of Chile will vote on in September. It has been a process of inspiration and hope, but also of controversies and especially of hard constitutional work. With Gabriel Negretto, I discussed the main political institutions of the new constitution. He describes the ups and downs and the milestones that were reached by the convention. He has followed the process up close. Almost exactly a year ago, I talked to Claudia Heiss in episode 8 about the incredible journey that Chile has taken from the overwhelming street protests that caused the popular votes on a constitutional convention to the drafting of a brand new constitution. Gabriel Negretto now comments on the continuation of this extraordinary journey. Gabriel Negretto is a full professor of political science at the Institute of Political Science of the Catholic University of Santiago de Chile. His research focuses on comparative constitutional politics, electoral and constitutional change and democratization. And he has also been a consultant to international organizations such as the United Nations and the Inter-American Development Bank, among many others. His most recent book is titled Redrafting Constitutions in Democratic Regimes, Theoretical and Comparative Perspectives, published by the Cambridge University Press in 2020. He has also published countless articles in top academic journals, including the American Political Science Review. I link to his website and his Twitter account in the show notes. I am your host, Stefan Kiburz, and this is the 23rd episode of the Rules of the Game podcast. I am a political economist with a PhD in economics from the University of Bern in Switzerland, and I previously held positions at the London School of Economics and Political Science and the Center for Global Development. You'll find a full transcript of this episode on my website, rulesofthegame.blog. I am always curious to hear your opinion, so just send me an email to stefan.keiberts@gmail.com. And please leave a review and share this episode with friends and colleagues. Now please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Gabriel Negretto. Gabriel Negretto, welcome to the Rules of the Game podcast. I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you for the invitation, Stefan. Nice to be here.
As always, I ask the first question, and that is, what is your first memory of democracy or of politics in general?
Well, I have several memories, but one that really has stuck into my mind, it's the image of massive crowds in 1983 in Argentina, right at the time of the election of Raúl Alfonsín as the new president of the inauguration of democracy after the military dictatorship. That's an image that has impressed me, and I think it's a salient memory for me, yes.
Did that kind of influence your career also in the end, or is this more a childhood memory? Or?
I'm not sure. Perhaps in some way it did. It did influence my career. Yeah, I got excited about politics. At the time I was not, really exposed to politics, particularly because I was living before in a dictatorship. I was young. So it was my first exposure to politics, and I was pretty excited about it. So probably it did have some effect on my future career. And now with the benefit of hindsight, I can say that I didn't know it at the time, but yeah, probably.
So today we want to talk about the Constitutional Convention of Chile that is in the process, as we speak, of drafting a new constitution. And that process started pretty much with, well, in the first place, huge protests in the streets of Chile, of Santiago and other cities. And that caused the government to propose two popular votes. One was to replace the old constitutions that is based in the era of Pinochet still. And the other popular vote was on whether to elect a separate constitutional convention. And that was in October 2020, and the people approved to have that process started. And the constitutional convention was then elected and first met 4th July last year. And since then, the process has been going on to draft this new constitution. So what were, from your perspective, what were kind of the experiences so far? What were the main events, and what are your takeaways so far?
Well, many things have happened since the election of the convention in May 2021. I would say that there were really high expectations and high optimism at the time when the convention was elected. The election was postponed for a year due to the pandemic. And at the time, everybody celebrated, myself included, of course, the way in which the convention was elected, the kind of representation that it achieved. Just for the audience to know, the regular rules for the election of the ordinary legislature were applied at the time, a proportional electoral system with 28 electoral districts with a medium type of magnitude. But several new rules were added for this special election. First, gender parity, that is, that half of the assembly will be made up of women and the other half of men. Second, reserve seats for indigenous peoples. Actually, 17 out of 155 seats were reserved for this type of representation. And then the representation of independents, but in a different form from the past. That is, not just as individual candidates or candidates that could get associated with a party list, but the law enabled them to present their own list, competing side by side with party list. Now, the outcome of the time was in a way unexpected, in the sense that the right really didn't achieve the type of representation that everybody expected. It didn't get the third of the seats that was needed to block decisions and force consensus, because the convention will make decisions by two-thirds, in order to adopt the new constitution. Actually, the right was pretty much in disarray at the time. They were always against the idea of a new constitution. They only accepted it because they thought it would be a way to placate citizen dissatisfaction with the status quo. They didn't really have many proposals, for the new constitution. So they caught the right, I wouldn't say by surprise, but they really didn't manage to mobilize their constituents, the voters. But in general, it was a big blow to traditional parties. Political groups associated with the new left gained more representation than political groups associated with the old and more traditional left, the one that was in charge of the transition, and the early years after the inauguration of democracy in Chile. So a new left reached more votes and more representation. Second, independents accounted for much more than the representatives of traditional parties and any type of political group. That was another important feature of that election. And then, as I said, gender parity and reserve seats for indigenous people, which really gave this convention a sense of renewal, of differentiation with everything that Chileans knew before in terms of political institution. Very different from the ordinary legislature that was working at the time. So, people, in spite of the fact that it was a big blow to traditional political parties in general and to the right in particular, I would say that on average, the sense was one of optimism, because that's why, a constitutional convention was elected precisely to renew politics, to create a new sense of a new beginning in the country. And certainly that type of representation that came out of the election of May 2021 confirmed that goal, right? That idea.
So quickly, I remember because I had Claudia Heiss on the podcast as well, pretty much 1 year ago.
Uh-huh.
And we were talking about, this the whole history up to the convention. So she also, I think she felt that sense of optimism and euphoria and renewal, which was really, really interesting. And I think one element that was in the history up to the election of the convention was also the electoral reform of 2015, right? That's what she was also mentioning, that, this introduction of proportional representation and a list system that was crucial, right, for bringing about a different representation, or probably a more legitimate representation also of the population at large.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, that's exactly what happened in the country. And over time, what happened is that, well, people started to see how the convention worked. There were some, I wouldn't say scandals, but some problems within the convention, like one delegate from a political group that was associated with social movements lied about a medical condition. Then important discussions and some sort of polarization about early decisions on the rules of procedure. Then that stabilized, and I would say that until the end of the year, that optimism was, on average, was maintained. I think things started to change after the presidential and congressional election, which show a very different landscape. Traditional parties regain popular support. The new rules that were applied for the election of the convention were not applied for the election of Congress. But in general, what we saw there was a country much more divided than what we saw in the election of the convention. I mean, divided in a very traditional way, divided between left and right, like 40% on each camp, in the legislature, compared to what happened in the election of the convention, where the left, really won many more seats than the center right, and the right. So it was a sort of return to an old distribution of preferences in the country. And that, kind of gave a different perspective of the whole process. Then,
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think that was also a reaction to what people observed in the convention? Was it like kind of a balancing act? So the people were thought like that the convention is very more kind of tilted to the left a bit, or to more progressive circles, and then they kind of wanted to rebalance it.
yeah, I think it was, but the extent to which it was a balancing act, we cannot really disentangle, the whole causality of the process, because the rules were different. We can't keep the rules constant. That's a problem, because the rules by which the convention was elected changed by the time that the new Congress was elected. But certainly, there was higher participation among older people that were either against the constitution making process, or were, agnostic about it. So people that didn't vote at the time. That's another thing. So, because at the time of the election of the convention, the percentage of participation of young people that is below 40 was much higher than in previous legislative elections and in the election of 2021. of the legislature of the November 2021. So even that changed. So we can't keep many variables constant to determine, how the electorate reacted. But I think it was, and that's the way in which it has been interpreted. And so it, people tend to perceive it that way. So there was a kind of correction to an imbalance that occurred at the time of the election of the convention. Then what we have by February, it's the reports of the commissions that worked on particular topics like political system, citizen rights, judicial system, all these topics. So reports are starting to come first in the general approval, then in the particular approval of the provisions in these commissions, and several debates emerge, public debates emerge about the reports and the proposals.
So
Yeah,
it was really a publication of the proposals, and this kicked off a public debate. Is that correct?
it kicked off a public debate. Particularly became clear that the convention did not just want to introduce social rights, strengthen civil rights, and introduce a few mechanisms of direct popular participation. They really wanted to do much more than that. I'm saying that because the expectation at the time of the social mobilizations of October to December 2019, or by the time that the decision to get to approve a new constitution was made, really the social demands were related to substantive public policies in generally the expansion of social rights, better access to education, wider and better access to education, public health, social security. And there were not many more demands in terms of, say, the political system, the judicial system. But it became clear when this committee started to work that they wanted to go much further. They wanted really to reshape the political landscape of the country.
And leave less room to the legislatures, right? Like to
Exactly.
already determine a lot of basic laws.
Well, to determine many details for the future legislature, but also to to change traditional features of the political system. Like for instance, one debate that was important between February and March was the elimination of the Senate, right? Not that the public will pay lots of attention to this, but it really caught the public eye in the sense that it became clear that the convention wanted to do much more, go much further in terms of transformation than just simply expand rights, which was the expectation, right? And many of these changes were controversial, were very controversial. The same I could say about the idea of creating parallel legal systems, one for ordinary Chileans and nationals, and the other for indigenous peoples, right? Even though the details of this juridical pluralism, as it was called, and it is called, are not clear for the ordinary citizen, what it became clear is that this was going much further than what was expected, in terms of getting, say, better education, more intervention of the state in the provision of basic public goods. So at the time between February and March is when we start to see uh, an increase in the criticisms to the convention and a decrease in the levels of trust. So it kind of coincides with the time in which the concrete substantive proposals came out. Again, not because citizens were paying attention to the details or were fully aware of the details, but because it caught by surprise, many voters or many citizens, the fact that this convention was doing more controversial things than they were supposedly called for at the time of the election in 2021. So that's one interpretation, and I have this interpretation. On the other hand, many things were going on in the country. The process has been long. Chile spent between October 2019 up to now, we are talking about it's going to be, 3 years almost of constitutional debate, so to speak. And the country, is experiencing other problems like, levels of inflation, for instance, that has never been experienced, a dramatic decline in the approval of the previous government, due to the handling of the social mobilizations of social conflict, but also the handling of the financial situation during the pandemic, many things. So I would say that in general, the mood of the country it's uh, it's gloomier than it was in say 2018 or even early 2019. The constitutional convention is working in a context in which the perception about the future of the country is not so certain, as it was in the past, as it was before the social mobilizations of October 2019. So that is affecting in many ways the process as well.
So people are more like trying to find more stability again, right? And obviously the also the old constitution in a sense provides some stability because they know what they have in it in a sense. And I guess like 3 years of discussions about these really fundamental issues is also exhausting, right? In a way, even also political scientists must be like like so intense, the whole process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Mm. I kind of want to discuss the different institutions where we see changes. And obviously, I mean, that some things you have mentioned, like this parallel legal system, that sounds super interesting also, but very fundamental in legal terms. But let me go back to the Senate. I think that's probably a good starting point because that created so much public debate also. So the convention decided to abolish the Senate and replace it with a chamber of regions. Can you explain how far, is this a definite decision and how far it got? And what are kind of the characteristics of that chamber of regions?
The first provisions that were approved in general in the Commission of the Political System in February, were the full elimination of the Senate and the adoption of a unicameral system. That triggered a huge debate, right? Among conventionals, the approval of the unicameral proposal was supported by a bare majority in the commission, of the political system. Then, in the newspapers, among scholars, it was said that revealed this radical goals of at least an important number of delegates in the convention, because eliminating the Senate and adopting a unicameral system was not just a reaction to the immediate past, whatever defects could be attached to the Senate as it worked, since 1990, and the legacy of the Constitution designed by Pinochet, which of course has been deeply transformed, during the democratic period. But it was going against the Chilean constitutional tradition, because the Senate has been in place for a much longer time than the dictatorship of Pinochet and the design of the 1980 Constitution. It existed, before. It existed in the 1925 Constitution. It existed in the 1833 Constitution. That is that this convention was really willing to transform, and that really triggered an important debate that I think led to some corrections, Many people argued that it was contradictory to eliminate the Senate and adopt a unicameral system, when, on the other hand, it was being declared that Chile will become a regional state, more or less following the model of the regional autonomies of the Spanish state. But certainly, having a regional state in which decentralization will be deepened, where local institutions will be strengthened, was at odds with the idea of abolishing a second chamber that could be designed to represent regional interests, right? I think that that was a very strong argument and led many delegates to backtrack on their positions. And that led to, subsequent negotiations in which a decision was made to adopt a chamber of the regions. Now, this chamber of the regions at the very beginning was a very symbolic chamber, a sort of, I would say, a formal second chamber with no powers whatsoever. Over time, because this also led to criticism, it was said, not without reason, that this second chamber was hiding a de facto unicameral system. So it also led to new negotiations in order to strengthen this second chamber. And as it stands now, in which the Chamber of the Region has been incorporated to the draft constitution with a list of powers that has been strengthened, much more than in previous reports. What we have now is a constitution that would establish an asymmetric type of bicameralism, but one that is much more moderate, and I would say, in a certain way, less radical a change compared to the past than it was in previous iterations. So we will have a second chamber with significant participation in every type of law that affects regional and territorial interests, and there will be asymmetries in the enactment of ordinary laws, but in these areas where laws will affect the interests of the regions, this second chamber will have an important influence. That is where the draft of the constitution stands now.
Okay, and is that a reasonable solution for you? Do you think that asymmetric solution for the chambers makes sense?
I think it is a reasonable solution. I think that the approach could have been more minimalistic, from the very beginning, in the sense that it could have taken the old Senate, changed the name, changed the way in which regions were represented, strengthened decentralization, and deprive the second chamber of an equal power in terms of ordinary legislation, and actually of any type of legislation, like, for instance, overcoming disagreement by a joint session of both chambers, deciding, say, by absolute majority, that will give automatically an advantage to the first chamber. And I think that that would have been an approach to an asymmetric type of bicameralism that would have been very reasonable. But that was not the approach of the convention. The convention started by eliminating the Senate. So, given that approach that the convention took, that I think it was mistaken. I think that the outcome it's reasonable. I think it's reasonable.
It was kind of going the other way around. It's first abolishing and then re-establishing, instead of
exactly
taking what we have and then changing slowly what we think is not working.
It started with a very extreme position, and it ended up with a much more moderate, acceptable position that really, that it does change, the constitutional tradition in Chile, but not so radically, not so dramatically as it would have been.
Yeah. And the first chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, were there any changes proposed, or will that really pretty much stay as it is, including the electoral law?
Well, no, there were changes also in terms of the Chamber of Deputies. Well, first of all, in terms of powers, the most important change perhaps is that this will be a chamber that will, predominate in most areas of legislation. Also, that it will decide by simple majority, except in some specific pieces of legislation. As you probably know, the Chilean constitution had qualified majorities for a wide range of matters and types of laws. That was eliminated, and again, the same story as in the case of the Senate. It started by adopting a unicameral type of legislature, deciding by simple majority, and then it restored a second chamber, but also it accepted the idea that some laws should be approved by a qualified majority. So that was also adopted in this draft constitution. For instance, electoral laws are going to be approved by qualified majority, not by simple majority. So that was another area in which the most radical, delegates backtracked from their
Hmm.
previous positions.
Kind of safeguarding a few, like
Yes,
certain legislation.
yes, exactly. In terms of representation and elections, of electoral rules, the most important change is in terms of pluralism in representation. The parity rule was adopted across the board. That is, any collective body that is elected will have to adopt, and also unelected bodies, actually. So the gender parity rule has been adopted across the board for any collective body.
Okay, wow.
That was expected, but it has been established. Then the same with reserved seats for indigenous peoples. It has also been adopted for every type of collective body, right, including the Chamber of Deputies.
Hmm. So to clarify, so this rather resembles the electoral rules used for the Constitutional Convention, right?
Exactly, and that confirms, a proposal made a long time ago by political scientist Jon Elster, that constitutions tend to follow the image of the convention that produced them, right? So unicameral conventions tend to adopt or try to adopt, unicameral legislatures. The rules of elections, tend to be reproduced in the new constitution and so forth. So to some extent, that has been true, except in one area, the election of independence. The experience with independence, particularly the election of list of independence, as it was allowed by the time of the election of the convention, has been very negative. I think that many people at this point believe that was even a mistake,
Hmm.
right?
So there
Because
were
that
people think that there are too many independents in the convention. Yeah.
too many independents, and the results of having a convention, a collective body, really working through a collection of individuals without the capacity of preference aggregation, forging, agreements among large number of delegates and sustaining those agreements, has been seen in a negative light, and I think also not without reason, because this is exactly what the convention shows. Very difficult to forge agreements, to sustain those agreements, across issues and areas of design, and that's because of the absence of parties.
Hmm.
This is
So it's a lot of
this is a part.
fragmentation, right?
Oh yeah, oh yes. It's more than party fragmentation. This is a fragmentation period. Fragmentation in terms of individualities. So even political groups that were not very cohesive, divided themselves. So yeah, as many people have said, the proof that it's not good to have a collective body without parties, it's the convention,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So that rule was not adopted, but there has been a huge debate about the role of independence and the role of social movements. In the end, as the draft stands now, there is no rule adopted in general for the presence of independence, or for the radical separation between social movements and political parties. So that's another area in which the convention, or say, or more precisely, majorities in the convention have moderated themselves, because without the criticism that follow, some attempts at the beginning to include independence, to create particular rules for social movements, separate from parties. Without that criticism, probably we will see today a more exact reproduction of the rules by which the convention was elected. You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's probably also that kind of overreaction, right? That people have really bad memories of certain parties, or they have bad experiences with big parties, traditional parties, and then they kind of go over the top and, like ask for independence, but they disregard the fact that independents have much harder time to find agreements, right? So the parties are still really important in the end for political work.
Of course, and I think that even ordinary citizens now realize about that. Also, because parties, of course, they work through platforms, programs, right, where they have to reconcile, positions on several areas, on several dimensions. Whereas independence, I mean, they just take single issues,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And this is what happened with the convention. So you have many delegates that really care about one single provision, or perhaps one chapter of the Constitution, if at all, you know. And so it's very difficult to negotiate, make exchanges, and really produce collective, consistent, and coherent collective decisions with that type of agenda.
and also it's hard to kind of for the people to recognize what people really stand for, right? So that
Exactly.
makes it hard on both sides, both in parliament, but also or in a convention, and for the people to make choice.
Right. One more thing about the electoral rules is that there was an attempt. There was an attempt to reduce, even, you know party fragmentation for the future. There were several drafts of the report before they were sent to the plenary, that included, provisions such as an electoral threshold of 4% in order to have access to representation. Um, Also, an important rule that was pretty much debated, and it seemed at one point that it had importance, that it had some support. There was the provision according to which the Chamber of Deputies will be elected simultaneously with the runoff presidential election, in a way so that the legislative election, so the results of the presidential election will spill over the legislative election. But that was not adopted finally, and it was eliminated also the threshold, which makes a lot of sense, because from the point of view of partisan self-interest, because for many delegates and for many political groups, which are all minoritarian here, adopting this type of provisions will have been suicidal, right,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
many ways.
Excluding themselves.
So excluding themselves for the future,
Mm.
not good for the system, but good for themselves. So I'm not surprised that that's initial seeming consensus about these rules to moderate fragmentation vanished, because it's what you would expect out of partisan electors.
So in terms of executive power, On my podcast, I talk a lot about presidentialism, parliamentarism, hybrid forms, etc. What was the discussion in the convention about that topic? Like, Chile, obviously, with the presidency, as far as I know, that is not questioned fundamentally. So, as far as I have seen, the presidency will stand.
Yes, definitely. The new constitution will maintain the presidential system, the basic structure of presidential regime. There was a debate at the very beginning when the Commission on the Political System started to work. There were proposals all over the place. There were parliamentary proposals, there were semi presidential or mixed regime proposals, and presidential proposals. In the end, what the alternative that won the day was the idea of keeping the presidential system but reducing at the same time some important powers of the executive, particularly in the legislative arena. The Chilean president stands out as one of the strongest executives in the region in terms of legislative powers, particularly in agenda setting powers. Strong powers for the exclusive initiation of legislation in financial areas. And that's really what the convention and the commission on the political system, in particular, focus on. So the exclusive initiative was transformed, and it wasn't eliminated, but it's not exclusive anymore. So Congress, actually the Chamber of Deputies, can also make proposals, in financial areas for the creation of taxes, for instance, or the abolition of pre-existing taxes, along with the president. But something like an exclusive initiative or the necessary support of the president was included, and in that sense the powers were reduced compared to the past, but not dramatically, in the sense that the president has to support this project when they are initiated by the legislature. Without that support, the the bills cannot be enacted, right? Then the veto powers of the executive have been weakened. you know um, well, first of all, because now you have one chamber that predominates over the other, but also because the override, the threshold for the veto override has been diminished from two-thirds to four-seventh. And actually, let me correct that. I think in the last version approved, it's from two-thirds to three-fifths. That is from 66% to 60%. But with an important distinction between partial and total veto, because partial vetoes or partial observations can be overridden by a simple majority. That's another area in which the powers of the executive have also been weakened.
Okay, that's interesting. Because I always think like the only way a presidential system can work is if the president is not too powerful. So if the president has really to consider, the opinions and the processes in Congress, that's the only way I think a presidential system can maybe work, and is not, the whole discussion on presidents becoming too powerful, right? Which is a danger to democracy itself.
Well, yes, but you see, a functioning presidential system, it's supported by a very delicate balancing act, because the president should not be too powerful in order to, overcome any or pass over any objection or control by the legislature. But on the other hand, it can't be too weak either, because if you have a too weak a president that, on the other hand, it's directly elected by the people, you do have a problem.
Yeah, that's true.
And presidential systems can be very dysfunctional if you have too weak a president. So the balancing act is that you need a president that is neither too powerful nor too weak. And that also has been part of the debate because in the first draft, again, same story as in the case of the Senate, the weakening of the presidential powers was very extreme in the first versions of the report of the Commission of the Political System. Not only the Congress will be unicameral and will enact laws by simple majority, but the veto override will be always by simple majority, right, in a single chamber. So basically, and then with the transformation dash elimination of the old exclusive legislative initiative in important financial matters, that led to a very diminished role for the executive in the early versions of the proposals. Now, in the final version, the one that stands now in the draft of the new constitution, I would say that, yes, the legislative powers have been weakened, but in a much more moderate way.
So I still have so many questions, and we could go in so many directions. But one topic I still like to talk briefly about is, direct democracy or direct participation of the voters. Have there been any more substantial rights in terms of maybe initiatives or referendums?
Oh, yes, all kinds of mechanisms of direct participation or direct democracy has been included. The final shape is not completely finished because there has been some rejection of previous norms in the of those norms in the plenary, so they are being decided as we speak, very soon. But yes, this is going to be a constitution with almost every type of mechanism of direct citizen participation that you could think of, you know, from popular initiative for ordinary laws, popular initiative for constitutional reforms, popular initiative for the replacement of the constitution. That is, a specific type of popular initiative in which citizens can collect signatures to activate a constitution making process, that is to replace a constitution.
Yeah, that was actually the very first type of initiative that Switzerland had. Like the first constitution knew that rule that the citizens could initiate a complete overhaul of the constitution, and only later there was the element added that there can be a partial amendment of the constitution.
Yes, there's gonna be different types of referendums, for the approval of constitutional reforms, for the approval of particular norms, then recall, not just for local but also for national authorities. I haven't seen the last provisions in terms, I mean, the final shape of the recall mechanisms for deputies. And there were proposals also for the recall of the president. I'm not sure, I haven't seen the last version now, but it could be the case, it will be the case that we will have recall for national authorities, at least for the legislature, and it might be the case that the president is also included.
Okay, wow, that would be quite a strong instrument.
That will be quite strong.
Yeah,
yes, definitely. Yeah. So no, this was very clear from the beginning. That this will be a participatory type of constitution, which is also a strong reaction to the past. Chile is one of the is actually the, I would say, the single constitution in Latin America right now. The 1980 constitution, even after several amendments over time, that doesn't have any single mechanism of direct citizen participation in national issues, except for the possibility of participating in constitutional reforms when the president disagrees with the legislature. But that was a provision that in fact enhances the power of the president, not that expands you know, the ability of citizens to participate in national affairs. So basically, it's a traditional representative type of constitution, with no instruments whatsoever of direct citizen participation. And the new constitution is going to be quite the opposite.
That's very interesting that the people now really think like, okay, they want to keep the power also with the people, right? Not give it back to the presidency or to the legislature.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. That's super interesting. Also, on the way forward, how that's gonna play out. For example, the recall, I think is also quite a strong an instrument. Which I don't know much about it actually, because we, for example, in Switzerland we don't have it, and I haven't I read so much about it. But yeah, that's so kind of the full version of direct democratic rights.
Yes. Exactly.
So, for people who want to read up on these topics, where can people maybe find like a summary of developments, or can you recommend something in English that has been written?
There have been several works published while the process is ongoing, but of course, those works are by necessity partial, and just capturing parts of the event. There is, well, this sounds like self promotion, but it's inevitable because it was a full issue in December of 2021 by the Hague Journal on the Rule of Law, dedicated to the Chilean constitution making process. I'm saying full promotion because I'm the author of one of the
Yeah,
articles,
yeah,
but
sure.
there are several authors as well, taking different perspectives on the Chilean constitution making process, and that's in English, of course. I don't have now the exact volume of the issue, but it was
No, I
published in
will I
December.
will link to it in the show notes for sure.
And I'm not aware of any other recent work in English. There are several in Spanish.
I will link to
Um,
those as well, because a lot of people speak Spanish.
most of the articles or notes that I have read are in the news. So, like extended notes or critical reflections.
Yeah, that's fine. I will link to those. I mean, also like newspaper articles. They are very interesting for a broader audience. Just to have like kind of a summary of what's
Yeah.
going on. Yeah. Okay. So, Gabriel Negretto, thanks a lot for taking the time. It was super interesting. Many insights for me, and yeah, I hope the process will find a positive end, and hopefully, if yeah, the election will be in September. Is that right?
The final referendum, the ratification referendum, will be in September. Uh, we can't really make a prediction or certain, but no prediction can be certain, at least not in political science and in the social
Mhm.
sciences in general. If I were to make a prediction, I would say that the new constitution will pass. Well, just because, in spite of the many controversies they have emerged and criticisms of the convention, I think that in the end, people are going to have a choice between having a constitution without social rights, without mechanisms of citizen participation, and one with them. So I think that in the end, that it's gonna tilt, the vote toward the approval. Now it could be a close win. It could be a 55-45, which is probably not so good, or it could be a greater win, like 60-40, 65-35. We don't know. But is it possible that the constitution could be rejected? Well, yes, we can't rule that out completely. Although it's the percentage of people that are declaring that they will vote against the constitution has been increasing. And now, for instance, the last poll, that came out 2 weeks ago, says that 48% of the people will vote against, whereas only 35 will vote for the Constitution. I'm not sure how much we can rely on those polls, but certainly the margin of rejection is it's increasing lately. So we can't discard the possibility of rejection. I think that in the end the Constitution will pass, but certainly, it's probable that the referendum is going to be polarized in many ways.
But there is also still a few months, so let's see how the discussions develop. And,
we need to know. We need to see how it develops.
Definitely. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel, for the conversation, and wish you all the best, and Chile for the constitutional process, and hopefully with a happy end.
Thank you so much, Stefan.
Thank you.
Let's hope for that.